Good morning. Good morning, Mr. McKeever.
Morning, Lord.
We resume Mr. Poplett, but with a different topic.
We do Mr. Poplett on water today.
Good morning, Mr. Poplett.
Good morning.
Yesterday you affirmed that you would tell the truth in relation to the evidence you gave yesterday. Can we confirm that that affirmation relates to the evidence you're about to give today?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Now, Ms. McKeever.
Lord. Morning, Mr. Poplett.
Morning.
Given you were here yesterday, I don't need to do the long introduction that I would do for most witnesses. Yesterday you were speaking to us about ventilation. Today I'd like to ask you some questions about the water system at Queen Elizabeth. In that regard, you've submitted two documents to the inquiry. Is that correct? Now, the first of those is your expert report, which should be at page 354 of that bundle. You'll go on one page, perhaps. Do you recognise this document, this table of contents?
I do.
And do you adopt this report as your evidence to the inquiry today?
I do.
Now, largely during the course of today's evidence, I'll be referring you to parts of this document, so it will come up on screen and remain on screen, as I think your other reports did yesterday. But sometimes I'll be referring you to one or two other documents and they'll take its place. One of which documents might be the second document that you submitted, which was your response to a Direction 5 questionnaire. Do you recall that?
I do.
And if you bring that up on screen, that should be bundle 21, volume 6, at page 137. And you see that page is a letter of instruction to you, and the next page is this the start of your responses?
Yes.
And do you adopt this as your evidence to the inquiry today also? Thank you. Now, at the start of proceedings yesterday, there were some questions about your position as an expertise and specifically your extent of your expertise and the limits to that expertise. In terms of this report, if we have the main report in front of us, you introduce yourself beginning at page 358. And 1.1.1 sets out you're providing within Appendix 1 details on qualifications, experience and knowledge to act as expert witness in relation to healthcare domestic water systems. I'll look at that in a moment, but just to continue through this paragraph, you state you're an authorising engineer and currently employed as an independent healthcare consultant. When you say authorising engineer, is that an authorising engineer in respect of water?
It is, yes.
And there are other matters where you also act as an authorising engineer?
Yes, ventilation.
Continuing that sentence, your role is to provide input expertise to health facilities in relation to design review, installation, validation, operational management of water and ventilation systems. As an AE, act as an independent professional advisor to the healthcare organisation, have been peer reviewed and operate now as registered AE for both water and specialist ventilation systems. Is that correct?
Correct.
Peer review process by Institute of Healthcare Engineering and State Management provides a level of assurance that have been assessed by peers to work and act in a manner and standard which meets the Institute's code of practice and conforms to the requirements of the SHTM. I have over 35 years' experience of healthcare estates management, working in that time as a contract installer, operational engineer and manager within the NHS and as an external independent consultant, and that's your authorising engineer position. Is that correct?
Correct.
Reference made in that paragraph to Appendix 1, and if we look at page 458, we'll see that. And again, I think you covered this yesterday, but this is in broad terms, trained and qualified as an engineer for 85 to 89. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your NHS employment starts in 1992, so the large paragraph on the page at Newcastle. Is that right?
Yep.
And you continued with NHS until 2009 at Northumberland, and since then you have been independent consultant with your own company, I presume, Andrew Poplett Enterprises.
Correct.
Can I just ask you one thing about that? During that time at the NHS, were you engaged in water matters?
Yes.
Was that throughout or for periods within those 17 years?
It was throughout that period at different levels and different roles. I was a responsible person for water during my time at Newcastle General Hospital, and as the Northgate and Prudder and Northumberland Tyne and Wear, I was engaged as a senior operational manager overseeing water issues and a member of the water safety group for both organisations.
Thank you. To finish this off, to the next page, the very top of it records some memberships of professional bodies. I suppose this is some of which are water appointments, some of which are ventilation. Is that right?
Correct.
Which of those ones mentioned here are the water appointments?
Specifically, it would be a member of the water technical platform of IHEAM.
Thank you. The other side of the coin to the expertise question is limits to your expertise. A couple of matters are put to you, and you can tell me whether you consider your expertise does or doesn't extend to those matters. The first one is clinical expertise or experience. Would you consider yourself to have any expertise in that domain?
I am certainly not a clinician and would never claim to be so. However, over the 17 years and indeed really full 35 years plus of my career, I've worked in close cooperation with numerous clinical disciplines, including some highly specialised clinical areas such as severely immunosuppressed paediatric units, bone marrow transplant, solid organ transplantation, and highly contagious infectious diseases.
You yourself, you're not been a doctor, for example.
No.
And would you accept that you don't have expertise in matters around quantification of risk or infection prevention or control?
Again, I don't have specific qualifications in IPC areas, but have advised and continue to advise numerous IPC departments within healthcare organisations, and am a member of the Hospital Infection Society, now Healthcare Infection Society, and contribute to a number of their documentation and guidance standards.
Thank you. Can we go back to page 358, please? Paragraph 1.1.2, the lower half of the page, you set out the main two questions posed of you. I'll just read them out because they'll form the context of most of what I have to ask you today. Firstly, from the point at which there are patients within the QHRHC where the water systems, including drainage, in an unsafe condition in the sense that it presented an additional risk of avoidable infection to patients. That's the first question, is that right?
Yep.
And the second question, are the water systems no longer in an unsafe condition in the sense that they now present no additional avoidable risk of infection?
Yep.
And then one page on, 359, in a number of paragraphs, you set out the duties of an expert as regards assisting the inquiry. No doubt you mentioned these yesterday, but they're matters such as impartiality, independence, not exceeding one's expertise, and so on. If you need to take a moment to remind yourself of what you said at this page, please do so. But I'd just like to ask you to confirm that you will continue to adhere to those duties.
Happy to confirm so.
Thank you. Now, moving on now to the very end of the introductory section at page 362. You conclude the introduction by having a section about building overview at 1.5. Can I ask you, did you yourself have the opportunity to visit the hospital?
I did, yes.
And so when you give a description, as you do at 1.5.1, of it being a 1,109 bedded adult hospital and 256 bedded children's hospital with large facilities, these are things you've seen for yourself, is that right?
It is, yes.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about the size of the hospital. Firstly, how did the size of it strike you when you visited?
It is a very large and facility which made up of multiple buildings. It is increasingly common to find very large centralised hospitals rather than what were more traditionally described as district general hospitals. But the hospital provides a high level of very specialist healthcare facilities, and co-location of those is not unusual, but it is a very large site.
What challenges are presented by a very large site such as that?
With regards to water systems, the larger the system, the more complex it becomes. The water distribution has to be across all areas that require access to water, and equally wastewater systems to take the waste away. The larger the system, the more complex the system, the more challenging it can be to maintain adequate circulation and temperatures, particularly with regards to hot water and cold water systems, through either latent heat gain on the cold water system or temperature loss on a recirculating hot water.
Is having a single domestic water system practical for a site that size, or for large sites, or does there come a point where it's no longer practical to run things off a single system?
There are areas where it is required to have separate smaller systems where there is a risk of backflow or increased need for backflow protection. So an endoscopy washer suite, as a prime example, will normally have its own dedicated segregated water supply. If you have renal dialysis, you will want that water treated in a different manner to the general water distribution system, and therefore it would be common to have it on a segregated water supply system. That system can be served from the primary system, or you can break it down into smaller systems. The most recent published update to HTM 0401, and I stress HTM, not SHTM, because I don't believe it has yet been adopted within Scotland, is the NHS England Estates Technical Bulletin 2024-03, and that highlights in certain augmented care and high-risk areas the benefit that can be considered from smaller dedicated water systems for the control of microbiological pathogens.
Okay, what I take from that is that there may be dedicated systems with separate needs, or needs additional to or simply separate from the general needs served by a domestic water system. And so there may be good reasons for that, to have separate water systems for such units. Is that part of what you were telling me? My question, perhaps, my intention was to focus slightly differently simply on sheer size of the system. You mentioned that larger sites mean that the system grows in complexity. Does complexity alone lead to a point where it becomes sensible to not try to run a single integrated domestic water system?
It is a decision that needs to be taken at the design stage as to whether a single system, the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. Any single distribution system has an inherent risk of single point of failure, which is that if everything goes through a single pipe and that pipe bursts, you lose your entire water system. A single system can have a benefit of reduced storage and reduced numbers of supplementary or subsidiary water storage facilities, and the more water that is stored, can increase the risk of microbiological proliferation.
Now, later in the report at section 4, if we simply go there, 397 is the page reference. You touch on what might be the same issue, might be a related issue. Here at 4.1.3, you're touching on size, certainly, because you're noting the extensive provision of items such as hand wash basins. And you say that that would today be considered potentially excessive. I wonder, could you tell us about that a little bit? Firstly, is that part of the function of the size questions that I posed to you a moment ago, or is this a separate but related issue that you have in mind?
It's certainly a related issue. The very fundamental basic 4 principles of a domestic water system is keep the hot water hot, keep the cold water cold, keep it all clean, and keep it moving. Part of the moving is to have, in practical terms, as fewer outlets as possible, as heavily used as possible. So we are looking to not have underused or little used outlets wherever possible, because if water is not moving and being on the hot water side recirculated and reheated, or on the cold water side it relies on usage to draw through, then there elevates the risk of temperature gain on the cold water or loss of temperature on the hot, and that can lead to conditions which will promote and support microbiological growth.
We know that at the Queen Elizabeth, the general design philosophy was in favour of single bedrooms. Is that an unusual approach, your experience?
No. Single bedrooms have many advantages, particularly for patient experience. People will prefer to be in a single room rather than an open ward in general terms. It also improves the risk or reduces the risk of airborne transmission in terms of infection. The downside is that it means that you normally need a greater number of nursing staff to monitor, undertake clinical observations, and in many cases single bedrooms end up with the doors being wedged open just because it's easier to keep an eye and respond to patient need by nursing and clinical staff. But generally speaking, the NHS has moved towards single bedrooms as opposed to the previous Nightingale open ward design.
From the specific perspective of a water system, however, having 1,109 bedrooms as opposed to X number of wards, what are the implications for that upon number of outlets and operation of the water system?
With each single bedroom, generally all having a dedicated ensuite, you end up with one patient using those facilities, if they are capable of using those facilities for their own needs. The result is that you get a far reduced flow rate or usage through those individual en-suites. If you had a 30-bedded Nightingale ward with one toilet block at the end of the ward, as the traditional design is, you had 30 people using one block of toilets, wash hand basins and showers. It got far more intensively used and therefore had a greater turnover of water.
Does it add at all to the complexity of the system in terms of pipework and so on?
It does.
Consequences for maintenance?
Again, if you've got to multiple thermostatic mixing valves on every whole body submersion area or hand wash basin, they have to be subject to maintenance every 6 months and every 3 times through stabilisation for changing, and then 6 monthly after that. all of those need physical access and maintenance. The temperature monitoring, if it's not done through the building management system, involves a lot more people going around taking a lot more water temperatures, and indeed where water sampling is undertaken, an awful lot more expense in terms of sampling.
Are there any other factors that you might wish to make us aware of that are important when it comes to having designed the hospital in the way it was, large number of beds plus single occupancy bedrooms?
The biggest challenge with any large complex water system is getting it so it can be appropriately validated and balanced, so we get the right water flow rates and a consistent movement of water. In hot water systems, this frequently ends up in, rather than just a primary hot water recirculating system, you end up with secondary and sometimes tertiary loops from the water systems, which can affect the temperature profile of the overall water system and can be difficult to balance effectively to make sure that all of the far extremities get adequate flow through to maintain temperature.
You mentioned a couple of times there an idea that was going to come on to later, but I may as well tackle it now. It's the idea of system balancing. Can you tell us about that, please?
Water, like anything else, takes the path of least resistance. Within a circulating system, it's important that we can achieve suitable water flow through all branches and elements of the system. Water will, as I say, take the path of least resistance. So where you come to a branch or T-piece, if it's from a larger bore pipe, it will want to continue travelling down that rather than going down a small side street. Imagine it a motorway network versus B roads and C roads. You use commissioning valves or double regulating valves or thermostatic mixing regulating valves to assist in terms of increasing the system resistance within the pipe to force the water down the prescribed route to ultimately what is described as the index run of a circuit, which is the furthest or most resistant leg of the pipework distribution system.
Does this speak to something inherent to the complexity of a water system in terms of if it requires to be balanced, then that suggests that no matter how good a job you do in the design phase, you can't necessarily know how it's going to operate in practice, for example, just where the water is going to go.
The pipe sizing, i.e. the distribution pipework, is sized so based on demand requirements, but there are only a relatively few number of pipework sizes. So you've got to then do, if you like, fine tuning of those smaller diameter pipes to achieve ultimate balance and flow around the system.
And you mentioned that valves might be part of the way of doing that. How does that work?
Valves have various functions depending upon their classification. They can be simple isolation valves, which are used to turn water off and stop it going in one direction in totality, or you can have double regulating or commissioning valve sets, which are used to partially restrict the flow to increase the system resistance to promote the water flow at the desired volume or flow rate throughout the system.
And that whole process of balancing, is that part of the validation process?
It's part of the commissioning process that is then confirmed through a validation process.
Thank you. May or may not return to that point later on. But for now, sticking broadly to the scheme of your report, if we move back to section 3, which is at page 370, you begin, here's your overview of healthcare water systems section. You begin here by giving us an overview of something you've alluded to already, which is the key components of the NHS standard for water system management by reference to HTM 0401. Firstly, I think we're all familiar with this by this point, but that's the English standard, whereas the Scottish standard is the SHTM 0401. Is that correct?
Correct.
How different are the two?
When it comes to water, the content is broadly the same, but the structure of the documents are very different. The HTM, the English version, concentrates everything into 3 documents. The SHTM is broken down into far more detailed sections and a greater number of documents, albeit that its content is broadly similar.
One difference that you do allude to in the report is the question of filtration, and that's a few pages further on at 376, section 3.5. At 3.5.1 here, you are setting out what's in the HTM, the English standard. And this, I think, is a quote from 7.2 of Part A. In exceptional circumstances, additional on-site filtration may be required as part of a multi-barrier point of entry treatment system. Advice should be sought from the appropriate undertaker on the need and form of such treatment. And firstly, point of entry treatment system, what's that? Where does that occur?
It is referring to the incoming water supply from the water authority.
So that's the mains input into the system. 3.5.2 is different in that it's dealing with point of use filtration. Is that at the taps?
It is.
Correct? And in general, am I correct in understanding that the general approach is that there isn't a requirement for such things, but the installation may be done case by case following an individual assessment. Is that right?
It is correct at the time of writing. It has been slightly amended since the Estates Technical Bulletin I referred to earlier for significant areas of augmented care where filtration is now more actively encouraged, and rather than assessing to see if it's needed, there is an assessment to see if it shouldn't be installed, as opposed, so it now more closely mirrors the SHTM approach, which is filtration should be considered and not just discounted on cost basis.
No, thank you. Setting perhaps that to one side, the specialist units or the augmented care units and the fact that it's very recent. Does what you've reproduced here basically reflect an assumption that if you have the mains water will be wholesome and that will be good enough?
Correct.
Scottish approach, as we said, is different. 3.6 at yes, just over the page is where you set out a quote from Part A of the SHTM. 3.6.1, 5.4 on-site filtration has been regarded by some as an optional provision despite its inclusion being mandatory since 1999. It is stressed that opting out of installing such plant should not be the default situation. Any decision to exclude filtration would be dependent on careful consideration of the following issues, and we present 5 of those in bullets there. So in Scotland, the default is to have filtration. Is that correct? And what's required is a risk assessment before opting out. Can you explain the difference? Presumably both jurisdictions have wholesome water in the main taps. Why should Scotland be different from England?
I can't comment on what the logic was at the time when the 2 documents were written or the thought process. What I would say is that it should always be subject to an assessment. The inference is that in Scotland it should be fitted unless you can justify not. In England, up until the end of August, it was presumed that it's not needed unless you can identify a specific reason why it is.
One of the points that you mentioned there, the last of the bullets, is that one needs to analyse samples of incoming water supplies. And the next paragraph, you see that last issue is particularly important. In existing premises, an examination of maintenance records would determine whether strainers were routinely becoming clogged as an indicator of a history of suspended solids being present in the water authority's incoming supplies. What are strainers? Are they different from filtration?
No, a strainer is a type of filtration. Typically, it is a single skinned perforated metal plate or similar basket, and designed to catch larger elements, whereas a filter can be multi-layered and slightly different construction. The best analogy I could probably draw is a strainer is a colander, whereas a filter is a sieve, in very, very crude terms, but it's about the level of particles that they are designed to capture.
Okay, if we stick with that analogy, then if the strainer is like a colander, a single sheet with holes in it, something that looks a bit like that. Whereas a sieve is a different type of thing. That's a interaction of layers or particular fibres. And you say that's what filtration is like. How does it work in terms of filtering matter to different levels, to different diameters, standards, and so on? How is a filter actually put together?
That is something for a filter specialist to give detailed response to, but it is made up ostensibly of multiple layers of fibres, and it relies on a number of elements to capture particles at different stages through the filter. It's not a straightforward grade that it takes out the bricks first and the fine stuff later, but it is made up of multiple layers to ensure the efficiency of the filter to capture all particles that it's designed to.
So thinking again about your analogy of one being a colander, a single sheet with holes in it, and whatever can make its way through the holes can get through. A filter's not like that. A filter depends upon multiple layers or a more difficult path through it.
In essence, yes. Again, filtration is something that you get different kinds of filters. If you have a hydrotherapy pool or swimming pool, you use a graded sand filter. So it is the water passes through a depth of very fine particles which capture other particles on the way through. So it gets into a very complex and scientific area in terms of design standards. But the basic principles are it is designed to capture and remove particles of a given size at a given efficiency rate.
Over the page at section 3.7, there's some discussion of standards of filtration mentioned in the SHTM. And again, as you say, a complex matter, I don't need to go into this in very much detail. But at 373, you are giving some units that might help. So this is still a quote from Part E of the SHTM, but you're saying to help achieve the above and minimise the formation of biofilms in pipework, following guidelines should be followed in selecting appropriate levels. Now, the first bullet relates to thermoplastics pipework, and here we've got a cutoff of 5 microns. Does that presumably mean that for that type of filter, things that are below 5 microns can get through, but above 5 microns can't?
Potentially, yes.
Now, if we go over the page, stainless steel has a different cutoff. Here, 0.5 microns can be relaxed to 5 microns on receipt of guarantees for the pipework. And then in the third bullet again, 0.5 microns, but that's in relation to copper pipework. Are you in a position, can you tell us why these are different? Why would plastic pipework be working to a different level of filtration from metal pipework?
The full technical reason I'm not au fait with, however, it is likely to result from the particles that can be shed or come from the pipework in use and the type of material used in the pipe, in how the water is being, what the water is being used for.
So this is in relation to things that might be shed from the pipes, it's the fabric of the pipe itself.
Correct.
Over
It's probably very obvious, Mr. Poplett, but the expression maximum cutoff, do I take it, well, if we take the example of maximum cutoff of 5 microns, is that no particle which is larger, wait a minute, have I got it the right way around? Yes, larger than 5 microns should be able to go through the filter.
Correct.
Right, thank you.
on the next page, at 3.78, you're taking a different source here. You're quoting from one of the employer's requirements. Invitation to participate in competitive dialogue is saying that board requirements for potable water to have 0.2 micron filtration, and it's referring to SHTN criteria. And you note that the specification of 0.2 micron grade filtration is in excess of the guidance standard of 0.5 microns. And then, however, the original filter media pore size was specified and installed to a 0.02 micron size, which may have impacted the available flow rate of the incoming water supply. First question is, why might the numbers here be different again? Why might one go below, if the SHTM standards are 0.5 microns for steel pipe, which we know was in the hospital, why would one wish to have 0.2 micron or indeed 0.02 micron size filtration?
That is a question which I'm not in a position to answer. It was presumably a conscious decision by the design team and health board to go for that level of filtration.
Have you come across that level of filtration in your other hospital work?
Not in general water supply scenarios, no.
If it's not in general supply, might some of the specialist supplies that we were talking about earlier require such tight filtration?
It may be more appropriate in some of the more specialist supplies, but again, in my experience, it would be very unusual to go down to 0.02 micron.
One, given the picture, the mental picture that we have now of a kind of tightening, squeezing net of as the filtration gets narrower, does it follow that there would be having filtration of that size would create implications for water flow?
It could well have implications for water flow, although the filter should be sized not only based on grade of filtration, but also desired flow rate. But it would almost certainly have an impact on the energy required to draw or force the water through the filter.
Just to dwell on both those points, you talk about size of the filter. Is that physically, is it simple as being the physical size of it? If you make the filter, the pore size smaller, then you can get around that by expanding the diameter
Yes.
of the filter, and thereby maintaining the same flow but through a much wider area. Consequences for energy, can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
If you're going to, the water comes in at a mains pressure rate. If that is fixed by the supply authority, then there is going to be a reduction in flow rate. To counter that, you could use booster pump, but a booster pump will need to run to draw the water through the filter and maintain an increased flow rate.
Thank you. Now, we've discussed the differences between SHTM and HTM. A few pages further on at 384, you touch on the perhaps thorny question of the precise status. And it's probably not the time or place to try and solve that question, but I am interested in the idea of how mandatory they might or might not be. You make some observations 3 pages further on at 387 about derogations. And here you are discussing the language in terms of modal verbs, and that they give examples of, I think, when derogations might or might not be contemplated at all. Would that be right?
Correct.
And going back one page to 3.12, here is when you're giving examples of when derogations should be considered. So typically there are many reasons cited to derogate from elements of even entire HTMs, HBNs, including but not limited to refurbishment, room allocation, cost, scope of project, and over the page, omission of compliance issues at business cases, or the last one, we haven't done it before or had it agreed on a previous scheme. The pages after that then go on, and I won't take you through those, but they go on to provide a fairly detailed account of expected practice when it comes to actually taking a decision. I'm not going to ask you about expected practice, but I'm interested in your impression of what practice might or might not have been at Queen Elizabeth when it comes to considering derogations. So we move on to page 394. You have a section here that's marked Assessment of Derogation Management at QUH. And to summarise my reading of this, you've reached the view that there appeared to be a not as full as it could be process, and that there was limited evidence of any managed or confirmed derogations. You make reference there to one derogation that's recorded relating to air changes. And then the last two bullets relates to two water issues, wet testing and flexible hoses. Firstly, am I correct that your general view is that derogation management was not as it could have been?
Correct.
What led you to that view?
The lack of evidence that any process was consistently applied where standards were deviated from.
What would you have expected to find had derogations been properly managed?
There is no national or centralised guidance per se for the management of derogation. As discussed yesterday, the section within the report relating to derogations is the world according to Poplett, not necessarily the world according to everyone else. And I accept and acknowledge that. But a process as laid out is what I would normally expect a good, robust derogation process to be based around assessment of risk and consequence, and making sure that the ultimate decision maker is able to sign off or agree or indeed reject any derogation based on an informed position.
And is recording part key to all of this?
Absolutely critical.
If we go back now to the overview section at page 370, you began with talking about standards. And then at 3.1.2, you're noting that, which I suppose is the essential purpose of HTM and SHTM, that draws together guidance and includes recommendations for the safe management of water systems. 3.1.3 covers the first thing you mentioned, the water safety group. I wonder if you can summarise what the formation, or rather, what should a water safety group consist of?
A water safety group should be a multidisciplinary team representing all stakeholders and act as a means of providing assurance to the organisation that the water systems are under appropriate control and operation. It should also act as a focal point when things go out of specification or aren't in line It should coordinate and review what actions to take and when to take them, and to what extent and how they should continue until a resolution has been achieved and the systems are back within normal specification. And finally, they should review any proposed modification, alteration or adaptation of the water system to ensure that all elements have been considered and the system remains safe and in compliance to the principal elements of the water safety plan, which also incorporates the water risk assessments.
Thank you. And in terms of who should comprise the water safety group, you've got 2 bullets at the bottom of the page that you say would typically include director, head of estates, estates responsible person, water, and then on the next page, a consultant microbiologist, infection prevention and control doctor, head of infection prevention and control, facility services manager, authorising engineer for water. Other key representatives may be co-opted onto this committee as and when required. Is it fair to say that that's fairly high level participation that you're looking for?
It is a combination of both high level individuals with the necessary expertise and decision-making authority, but also operational level who actually can report what is going on and what is progressing with any area.
Now, we know that there was a board water safety group for Queen Elizabeth. Do you know if there are also other water safety groups covering other specific sectors in the Greater Glasgow Clyde area?
I don't know.
In terms of your experience of water safety groups, what degree of commitment do these typically require of those who participate in them?
In terms of commitment?
In terms of time, in terms of attendance and so on.
You would typically expect the water safety group to meet on at least a quarterly basis. Depending upon the size and complexity of a site or trust, you are probably talking about a couple of hours. If you have large capital projects or works progressing, then that can be extended, or it can be done as a subgroup of the principal water safety group. And in a number of organisations which I support, because of the geographic nature and size, if you've got multiple hospitals within a healthcare organisation, it is not unusual to have an operational water safety group based at a site level, which then will send reports and representation to a strategic water safety group, which will deal with policy and decision making. So it can, in a small trust, be a couple of hours 4 times a year. In a complex hospital with multiple water safety groups in multiple sites, it can be replicated to increase that level, but broadly terms, it's 4 times a year for a couple of hours.
Thank you. Are these popular bodies to be part of, in your experience?
From an engineering perspective, in many organisations, the water safety group is seen traditionally as an estates function. In the last 10 years, I've seen a significant increase in the level of interest and involvement by IPC. It can still, to this day, be challenging to get clinicians and senior consultants to attend because they do not necessarily see it as their issue to manage. They just want the water systems to work and be safe.
Are you in a position to say whether that was an issue which arose at Queen Elizabeth?
I'm not.
To fill you in, we did get an account from one of the witnesses, Mr. Walsh, regarding his participation in the board, and he was for the initial period the co-chair. His position was, just to summarise, he was an infection control manager. Firstly, was that a suitable level of appointment that you'd expect to see upon a water safety group?
I would normally expect that the chair of the water safety group would be at a director level.
He went on to say that his involvement was, I think, relatively short term. He demitted from the group, and in terms of representation of infection control on the group, was replaced by an IC doctor and an IC nurse. Does that raise any concern with you as regards level of participation?
No, I think, given the size and complexity of the site, it may have been appropriate to have multiple representation, but if you've got a consultant microbiologist and a IPC nurse, then they will have the required level of knowledge of infection risk.
The final point that I noted from his evidence touches on a matter that I'll come on to separately, shortly anyway.
Sorry, I wonder if I could intervene now.
Yeah.
I just wonder if I've understood your answers. You're being asked about the membership of water safety groups. Now, water safety groups are a thing which is described and required by not only by HTM 0401 but also by SHT 0401. So if the starting position as to understand what it is to look at the guidance. You're being asked about the appropriate choice of chair. Now, would I be right in thinking that the guidance doesn't deal with the appropriate who should chair the group?
Correct.
Although I think it may point to who should be the members of the group.
Correct.
Right. Now, I'm not in answer when you said you would expect the chair to be at director level. Now, I take it that's you drawing from your experience elsewhere.
It is.
Right. Final question. I'm not sure if I can square, because I take it director level you have in mind on the board of either the trust in England or the health board in Scotland?
Yes, not necessarily an executive director, but certainly associate director or similar.
Now, does that square with the answer that you gave that you have no concern if the chair is an infection control doctor and or an infection control nurse? My problem there is I wouldn't necessarily see an or any infection control doctor or nurse necessarily to be a board member. So can you just help me with what I see as a sort of conflict there?
My understanding was that the two individuals replaced the deputy chair, not the chair.
Right.
So the DIPSI, the Director of Infection Prevention Control, I would assume, and perhaps wrongly, should have been the chair of the Water Safety Group or the Director of Estates, with the deputy chair being consultant microbiologist, infection prevention doctor, or lead IPC nurse.
I may inadvertently have introduced a little bit of confusion in my questions if it didn't come across clearly. The reference I had in mind was to Mr. Walsh's role representing infection control on the group as having been replaced by a combination of the infection control doctor and infection prevention control nurse. But that's not necessarily, and I'm not in a position, I'm afraid, to fill in as to whether his role as co-chair of the group was also inherited by those two. I'm drawing a distinction between his representation as, by his presence as representative of infection control and his presence in the role of acting as co-chair.
Right.
Could I also just clarify or add that, subject to the very recently published Estates Technical Bulletin, there's now further clarification on that when it comes to project-specific water safety groups, that they must be chaired by a director level. So it's not in the current versions of HTM or SHTM, but in the latest supplementary guidance note, it has added further clarification to that point.
For England.
For England.
Right.
Third final point that I'll just allude to from Mr. Walsh's evidence touches on a point I was going to come on to separately, but he'd spoken to not accepting it was his responsibility when on the board to have noticed that there'd been a specific failing, which was the failure to have appointed a designated person for water, on the basis that that particular appointment failed to be made by the Estates and Facilities team. Can you comment upon that understanding of responsibility? Does that strike you as correct?
The duty holder should either accept or fulfil the role of the designated person, or more commonly, delegate that to an identified designated person at board level to hold accountability and responsibility for the management of, in this case, the water systems. The designated person is the individual within the organisation who appoints the authorising engineer, who the authorising engineer ultimately reports to, and is also responsible for the appointment of any authorised persons within that engineering discipline, in this case, water.
Well, perhaps to put the question more broadly, that may be who has the job of making those appointments. But if the water safety group is not noticing that those appointments have not been made, is that an issue?
Yes.
On the same page, you talk about the second institutional document that you mentioned is the Water Safety Plan. 3.1.4, you're introducing that. And at 3.1.5, you describe its contents, series of modules which provide guidance and procedures for effective management of hospital water systems, typically consisting of following modules in the bullet list there. If we look at those, we see that second and third are Legionella prevention and Pseudomonas prevention. There are other entries related to water sampling, disinfection, and so on. So in terms of specific pathogens, the focus here seems to be on Legionella and on Pseudomonas. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we've heard material, and you may be aware of the fact that at the QH there were other pathogens, other microorganisms also identified, Cupria viridis, for example. Does that suggest that a more comprehensive plan would be required for Queen Elizabeth, given that there was a history of other gram-negative bacteria and atypical mycobacteria?
It may well do. It should be part of the risk assessment process in developing the water safety plan for the water safety group to agree the level, range and nature of any water sampling that is undertaken.
You've spoken a few times about the development of standards over the years. is, in terms of water safety plan, is that standard developing such as to make this more likely, or is the general requirement to risk assess what is required a suitable catch-all for determining what should go in a water safety plan?
The water safety plan is a collection of documents, and it draws a number of strands together. There is a requirement for a water risk assessment. That water risk assessment has within it prescribed content, but you also have water management policies, operational procedures, sampling plans, etc. So the water safety plan is intended as the umbrella catch-all for all things water. So in terms of, it is not necessarily a single document as such, because as I say, it's made up of multiple elements, up to and including maintenance records. But it is, I believe, intended to widen the remit of the management of water beyond that of simply an estate's function.
A third document that we have heard about on a number of occasions but isn't mentioned in this page is a written scheme. Can you give me a summary of what that is and how it fits into these water safety group water safety plan, if at all, that we've mentioned?
A written scheme is an element of the water risk assessment that, in its simplest terms, describes the elements that make up the water system. It should also include what levels of control or management are involved. It should also form part of the risk assessment process, in that you've got to know what you've got and how you're using it and what the relevant risks are to then establish an appropriate management approach.
Thank you. One page further on, at 372, you move on to the next section, which is about control measures. 3.2.1, you set out a list of temperatures. I wonder if you can just talk us through how this works. These are, as I understand it, are the Legionella temperatures. Can you illustrate what you're explaining to us here?
Yes, in simple engineering terms, Legionella bacteria as an organism is dormant if the water temperature is below 20 degrees centigrade. So it will not die, but it will not multiply. As the temperature increases, its ability to multiply increases to its optimum temperature of 37 degrees, which is also commonly known as body temperature. At 37 degrees, the Legionella bacteria will multiply approximately every 15 minutes. But the organism or the bacteria itself probably has a typical life expectancy of around 72 hours. However, after 72 hours of exponential growth every 15 minutes, the level of colonisation is highly significant. So it grows very, very quickly. As the temperature continues to increase, the rate of replication decreases, and if you reach 50 degrees centigrade, if you expose the bacteria to a temperature of 50 degrees centigrade, it will die within 2 hours. If you increase that temperature to 60 degrees, it will be dead within 2 minutes. And just because the iteration, it works at 70 degrees, it will be dead after 2 seconds. It is practically instantaneous at that temperature. And that is the fundamental underpinning of why the ethos for water is, if we can keep the cold water cold and the hot water hot, then the control of Legionella as a bacterium is not or shouldn't represent a significant problem.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, hot water hot, cold water cold. I understand that for Legionella, but it's not quite as simple for Pseudomonas at 3.2.2. Can you tell me about that, please?
Yes, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a bacteria that, again, cannot survive in hot water and dies at a slightly lower temperature than that of Legionella, but more worryingly can multiply at any temperature above 0.5 degree centigrade. So if you sample, for example, ice making machines or cold water outlets, you can find Pseudomonas aeruginosa in it, even though the temperature is below 20 degrees centigrade.
That appears to me to invite the question of what one can then do in a cold water system to control for Pseudomonas if it's in there. I know it's at 3.2.3 you're introducing the idea of chemical treatments, biocides. And you say filtration is principally used for Pseudomonas aeruginosa on cold water systems where temperature control cannot be practically used. I wonder if you can square that for me. If it can proliferate, it's above 0.5 degree. Presumably cold water systems are in the range below 20, but certainly above 0.5 degree.
Yes.
How does one control for Pseudomonas? Bearing in mind what we said at the start about filtration not being a necessary component of water system.
The way that you manage Pseudomonas proliferation is through usage. So where cold water temperature can't be used to stifle or minimize multiplication, if the water is regularly turned over, then it ceases to be at a level which represents a significant risk. In general terms, not exclusively, but Pseudomonas colonization of a water system is from an outlet or a wastewater contamination being transferred to a water outlet. It is not generally found within a water system and grows from the incoming supply to the outlet. It grows from the outlet back into the water system. So regular usage, regular flushing gets rid of that degree of colonization in terms of concentration. To clear it, if it becomes colonized, then you are looking normally at a chemical disinfection process.
You've been asked specifically about Pseudomonas because I think it's one of the microorganisms in respect of which there's specific guidance. But can one generalize from what you've said? When I say generalize, first step would be that not every microorganism will have the same reaction to a specific temperature. You mentioned Legionella because, again, the guidance is sort of structured specifically by reference. But having sort of taken that step, would it be generally speaking true of microorganisms that not all will be controlled by a water system which keeps within the Legionella parameters? In other words, cold below 20, hot above 55. So they won't all be controlled. However, as a matter of generality, would it be true to say that regular flushing and throughput of a system should sufficiently reduce the concentration of other microorganisms? Or alternatively, is it not possible to make a generalization like that?
That would be, I would suggest, a question for a microbiologist rather than an engineer. But in general terms, I would say that if the system was in regular usage, the temperatures were controlled within the parameters set for Legionella, then you will, in general terms, see few problems with Pseudomonas as well, subject to the other external or potential source management, wastewater, cleaning methodologies, contact with outlets, etc.
Right. Right. But the question is perhaps out with your specific expertise. Right. Thank you.
In passing, I mentioned a different alternative methods, chemical treatments. What's your general view on the use of chemical dosing as a means of controlling water supply?
Personally speaking, I'm not a massive fan. I would rather keep the water systems clean and within temperature range and in regular use. Chemical disinfection, either through continuous dosing arrangements, can be highly effective, but it does not provide any opportunity to relax other temperature controls or flow rates. It can have impact on lifespan of pipework. If you introduce a chemical such as chlorine dioxide to an existing water system, it can promote the failure of those pipework infrastructure through pinholing, and in some cases the scale is the only thing holding the pipe together, and if you strip all of that away, then you end up with a sprinkler system, not a water distribution system. So it is suitable in some aspects. I personally favour temperature control and usage as a primary means of control, unless specialist areas exist where it is needed.
We do know that a point came at Queen Elizabeth where chlorine dioxide was considered to be necessary and was used and has been used since. Any views on that particular method of biocide?
It can be highly effective and useful. It is expensive to install and manage, and it brings with it additional levels of complexity, and again highlights that the water distribution system has got to be appropriately balanced to make sure that the dosage makes it through to all of the elements of the pipework system at a sufficient and appropriate level of concentration. There are also some areas where you would not want to use chlorine dioxide dosed water for certain activities. One of the common areas of concern would be mixing of baby milk formula. There is some concern and questions over its appropriateness. But in general terms, it can be highly effective if appropriately managed.
Thank you. Moving on one page, you're bringing together much of what you've told us into the top paragraph there, where you describe design philosophy, minimise storage and ensure good throughput and avoid stagnation. You may have covered this already, but why are those the key points?
In particular for Legionella, if you can keep the cold water cold, it won't grow. If you can keep it above a certain temperature, it will die. And if it's in regular use and used, you will not get a build-up or concentration of a microorganism. And that is true for not only Legionella, but other microorganisms. So it's a case of regular usage. And if water stagnates, you also then challenge the effective keeping the cold water cold and keeping the hot water hot.
The last three bullets are dealing with flushing. Can you explain the significance of that, please?
Flushing is a necessary evil, I would describe it as. Ideally, you want all of the outlets that you have to be in regular use. If you cannot guarantee that they are in regular use, then flushing is used to, in effect, stimulate movement within the water systems. So it is there in place of identified outlets that may be little used but are still required to be there, to have water movement through them on a regular basis to avoid or minimise the risk of stagnation. The issue about recording it is that you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got a schedule of little used outlets. That schedule needs to be kept under constant review and management by the water safety group or through the water safety group to ensure that as occupation or activity within a premises changes, the flushing schedule may well need to change. If an area becomes regularly used, it can be taken off the flushing regime. But if an area is taken out of activity or has a reduced activity, then flushing may need to be introduced. So that is basically flushing. It needs to take place for a minimum period of time and a appropriate frequency, depending upon the clinical area involved in a hospital.
If I attempt to summarise that, we could imagine an ideal water system where there was flow through all of the pipework, because that's how the outlets and the inputs were designed, such that natural passage of the water would take it everywhere.
Correct.
Flushing is, in effect, an artificial substitute to cover areas where you can't rely on that happening.
Yes.
And the importance of recording it is because it's an artificial substitute, that one can't rely on normal day-to-day activity for doing that work. So there's no particular way to tell that it's been done. Therefore, you need to have it written down.
Correct.
Thank you. There's a bold heading halfway down the page when you move on to an overview of the cold water system. It's quite technical. I'm not going to go to very much of this, but over several pages, you've set out the journey of the water to the tanks, through the filtration units, which we've mentioned, and then through pumps to serve the building. 3.4.7 on 374. You've got, again, a technical description of pressure and how this happens. I don't need to ask you about that specifically, but I will tell you about one point that we have heard in evidence, and you may be aware of that already, is that at a point before occupation, there had been a bypass pipe set up, which ran from the mains input to some point beyond the booster pumps. Are you aware of that general issue?
I am.
It might actually be useful to look at the entry that records it on the DMA report. If we have Bundle 6, document 29, page 122, up please. Now, have you seen this document as part of your review?
I have.
It's the 2015 DMA Canyon L8 risk assessment. Reference to the bypass occurs on page 206. And if we see the larger of the paragraphs where the cursor went to immediately, description there was bypass pipework set up to run from the Hardgate Road mains to the domestic bulk water supply system connecting in after the booster pumps. This was noted through DMA's initial site walk-round and reported to estates. And just to fill you in, that initial site walk-round, I think Mr. Watson recorded that as being perhaps just before Christmas in 2014. DMA again noticed this during the site survey on 2nd of April 2015, again reported it to estates. DMA were advised in mid-April this had been removed by Mercury Brookfield. This line could potentially have introduced debris to the distribution system, which would otherwise have been removed by filtration units and could be a contributory factor to any out of specification microbiological results. Now, setting the microbiology to one side, I'm interested in the actual mechanism or the actual physical effects of the bypass. We heard evidence from a witness, Mr. McMillan, who, having discussed it and having had, I think, some role in having, possibly in having removed it or seen to its removal, when asked about what the purpose of it might be, was slightly at a loss, but he speculated that it might be a futile means of attempting to fill the upper floors of the system. Futile because of inadequate pressure. It's recorded on page 146 of his transcript, my lord. Does that seem right to you?
Sorry, my fault. You gave a reference to Mr. Macmillan's evidence in the transcript. Could you just
146.
146? Thank you.
Now, that was my attempt to summarise his speculation of what the bypass pipe might have been for. Can you comment on that? Does that seem a possible explanation for why it was there? Can you think of any better reason?
It may well be that it was introduced to wet the system to facilitate wet pressure testing, but if the incoming water mains pressure was not sufficient to reach the upper floors, then it would never have reached it. It requires a boosted pump set that operates at a greater pressure than that of normal mains water distribution. As I say, it may have been introduced for wet testing purposes, which again is not recommended within healthcare premises anyway. But other than that, I can't think why you would introduce a bypass onto a system that was designed to cover the height of building that the hospital has, knowing that the incoming pressure was not sufficient to reach the upper levels.
2 points from that I can maybe ask you about. On the pressure point, presumably the pressure would get the water part of the way up the building, but not all the way up it. On my rudimentary understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that would mean that the water became less active the further up you enter, the less mobile. Perhaps not the right way of putting it, but whether that's right or not, what would be the consequences of having attempted to fill the upper floors in this way, if that had been what was done?
The water system will find a natural level that its pressure permits. So the lack of circulation or activity, it would be dependent upon, it would only be created by either circulation pumps or people opening outlets at the lower levels which were wetted, which would then get some flow through the pipework systems. But the upper systems, which didn't have any water in, wouldn't make any difference if you opened the tap. In terms of wetting a system partially, or wetting it and then draining it down after, as soon as a system is wetted, it will be capable of microbiological growth. So the SHTM and HTM lay out the recommendation that all pressure testing should be done with medical grade air and pneumatically tested rather than wet tested using water, which will prove that the pipework doesn't leak, which is the purpose of the pressure test, without risking colonisation of the water system. Once it is wet, it needs to be kept wet, and it needs to be at that point managed actively through flushing or temperature control as appropriate. So an example would be, I had a site constructed, a 12 theatre block with mortuary. Everything was perfect. The water results were perfect, no problems whatsoever, until we connected the dissection tables in the mortuary. And suddenly there was high counts of microbial activity. On checking with the provider of the mortuary dissection tables, they wet tested them all in their factory and then drained them down, wrapped them in plastic and shipped them all over the place. And by the time it arrived at the hospital and was plumbed in and connected, it then seeded the rest of what had been, prior to that point, a very clean water system.
Thank you. Probably anticipated and ambushed my question, which was that if the bypass has been there for a number of months, what might happen? Anything else to add to the mortuary tables?
No.
Back to the report on the next page, 375. As I understand it, 348 and 349 here are essentially talking about the part of what's initially cold water, but then becomes the hot water system. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I'll come back to that topic in a moment. But at this point, I just want to notice that at the end of 3.349, the last three lines are referring to something called Kemper thermostatic balancing valves. What are they?
They are the valves I described earlier, which are a means of balancing or inducing a system line resistance to promote water flow in a preferred direction. They operate on a temperature basis, so it is, if there is sufficient temperature at that point in that branch, it will throttle down and the hot water will go in the alternate direction that the valve is controlling, and it will generally, what's normally described as, hunt until it finds a fixed point, at which point it will provide a steady state based on water temperature to establish flow.
Are flow and temperature therefore inherently linked?
Yes.
Because the aim is to have the whole system at the same temperature, give or take.
Correct.
And does it follow from that that it's similar to balancing, or it is indeed balancing, balancing is in the name, but the balancing here is to make sure that the temperature is the same in different parts because the flow is the same in different, because the flow is appropriate in different parts. And if you get all of that right, then both parameters will be correct together.
Correct.
Is that a reasonable explanation? Do you have anything
No,
to add to make that clearer?
it's one relies on flow rate manipulation, for want of a better term. The other relies on temperature manipulation. But if you get the right, you end up with the right flow rate because you've got the desired temperature. If you get the right resistance, then you get the right temperature because the flow rate's correct.
Does that hold for both hot and cold water systems?
No, you can't thermally balance cold water systems because cold water systems don't recirculate.
Thank you. .4.11 is about the design philosophy of ensuring turnover. I think it's the same issue that we spoke about before, making sure that water is constantly moving from one end to the next, or constantly moving within the hot water system as appropriate. Is that correct?
Correct.
3.4.12, we are on to filtration again. Now, we've covered that already, but there's one point I wanted to ask about the focus of this paragraph. Is the focus here about filtration within individual parts rather than filtration as regards the system as a whole?
Yeah, the filter basket or strainer within a thermostatic mixing valve is typically there to protect the seat of the valve from any physical contamination which might prevent it from fully closing on its seat.
So that's to protect the valve, and if we go over the page at the top, there is, I think, a different type of filter, point of use filters you're considering. You say point of use filters can also be considered, but these should only be considered if there is a significant operational issue and as a temporary protection precaution to users, patients, whilst an issue is being addressed. You see that?
Yep.
Now, in broad terms, you're familiar with these. They fit over the tap, is that correct? But you're making a couple of points here. First one is they're temporary, is that correct?
In my opinion, they should be considered as a temporary solution.
And secondly, they themselves can present a risk.
Yes.
Or are capable at least of doing so. Just to interrogate that a little bit, are you aware of situations where point of use filters have been placed in the long term as a control measure?
Not on a long term as a permanent solution. I have seen them deployed for periods of months whilst rectification work is undertaken to underlying infrastructure issues.
And at the end of the paragraph, you're making reference to the risks of leaving the filters in situ for a long period. If left in place for extended periods of time, they can also become colonised with microbiological contamination and can potentially act as a seedbed for further system colonisation. You see that?
Yep.
Firstly, when speaking about extended period here, what you have in mind is that long-term and subject to manufacturer's instructions for replacement, or long-term when there's no replacement, when replacement has been forgotten?
All of the manufacturers of point-of-use filters will give a recommended life expectancy for that filter. An example would be if you have at your own domestic home a fancy American-style fridge freezer that's got a water dispenser of chilled water in it, there will be a water filter within that line, and you will get a light up on your fridge door telling you when it's got to be replaced. More often than not, when you look on Amazon and see the price of them, you go, I can live with a light and leave it there. The problem is that a filter acts as a concentrator of the organisms that it may be filtering out. And in the right temperature conditions, those organisms will multiply. So leaving a filter in situ that is beyond its recommended change period can act as a source of proliferation of a particular microorganism. Equally, when you fit a point of use filter to an outlet, it restricts the water flow through that outlet because the water now has to overcome the resistance of the filter. So in the recent, in the reference I made to a reasonably long-term deployment of point-of-use filters, one of the areas that they were fitted to were shower outlets because they are at increased risk of Legionella because of the aerosolization of the water particles through the shower head. Unfortunately, if you fit a point-of-use water filter to a system that was designed without a point-of-use water filter in place, the water flow rate took you about 10 minutes to get wet enough to lather up. So the flow rate through the outlet was significantly impaired by the provision of the filter. You also still need to water sample to check as to see whether remediation has been effective. You can test the water having passed through the point-of-use water filter to provide assurance that the filter is operationally efficient, but ultimately you want to test the water prior to the point-of-use filter to know whether it's safe or not to remove. In doing that, you've got to be very careful of potential false positive readings that if you remove the water filter to then take the water sample, that water filter is then introduced to the surrounding area and can be contaminated. If it is then refitted to the tap, if the manufacturer permits that, then it can lead to false positive results rather than a true reflection of the water sampling of the raw water condition at the outlet.
Right. Thank you. You were, I think, alluding there to potential contamination, presumably also of the surrounding area by touching from a used filter. I'd understood the reference at the end of that paragraph to the seedbed to be a slightly different issue. What do you have in mind there?
If the filter is left in place for longer than its recommended period, then the concentration of the microbiological agent present can in effect act as a culture for that microorganism. It's getting low flow through. It can grow through the filter if left long enough, but it can also feed back into the water system as a source or seeding route of the microorganism that's present in the filter.
Right. Perhaps if we look at both of those when you're talking about if it's left long enough, then I think the backwards route, you're envisaging a scenario where it can, whatever organism it is, can grow from the filter back towards the water source into the system. You mentioned also potential for growing through the filter. The filters are very fine, microns, less than a micron. How would that happen?
Because it breaks down over time with exposure to the water and the organism. The analogy I would use is an ivy plant. It will find a way through pretty much anything, and a microorganism, if it proliferates, will penetrate through a filter. A filter cannot be completely sealed because it's got to let water through. So it can also grow through, if given enough time in situ, organisms will grow through.
An important factor there is enough time.
Yes.
So therefore, in the cases that you're describing here, potential acting as a seed bed or becoming colonised, both of those are predicated upon filters have a particular filter having been left in place for too long,
Yes.
i.e. not replaced when it should have been. Just specifically in terms of seedbed or seeding, are you aware of any scientific studies that have shown filters as a locus of seeding of a system?
No.
Lord, that's the end of that particular section of questioning. It's mid-morning.
We'll take our coffee break now. Mr. Poplett, if I could ask you to be back for 5 to 12. Thank you. Oh, Ms. McKenna.
Thank you. Just before I move on, Mr. Poplett, we were speaking about point of use filters just before the break. The one point I didn't put to you was that if point of use filters are still present in the hospital today, does that indicate anything to you?
It indicates that the evidence should still support that there's an ongoing problem with the management of water, because in a well-designed, well-installed system, they shouldn't need to be a permanent feature.
Now, we've just been through a long section about overviews of the, I think, cold water system. One point we passed by was, we'll go to it since we've had the break, 3.4.9, previous page 375. I may have read out that last sentence already, but the Kemper thermostatic balancing valves installed in the system in line with the design to ensure hot water is available within 2 minutes at every outlet. You've told us about how the balancing valves work, but the reference here to ensuring hot water is available within 2 minutes at every outlet, I wonder, can you reconcile for me the idea that I think I picked up of the ideal state being hot water everywhere in the hot water system, with the idea that it might take 2 minutes for hot water to reach the outlet?
I would actually acknowledge that that is a typo, and it should be 1 minute for hot water. It's 2 minutes for cold water.
Thank you. Notwithstanding that, why the gap?
Right. The hot water circulates continuously to maintain its temperature. However, the pipe that connects to the tap has a single pipe connection. So you should get the return point as close as practically possible to the outlet. So the shortest length as possible of potentially stagnant hot water exists. And the reason why it should be 1 minute is because that is constantly flowing around the system. It should take a short period of time, ideally far less than a minute, to achieve the hot water temperature. Cold water temperature does get 2 minutes because the cold water system is a non-recirculating system. So you only get movement in the cold water system when somebody opens an outlet. And therefore, the time when that temperature is at the outlet has an allowance of 2 minutes in place of 1 minute.
Specifically in respect of the hot water, I've certainly picked up a picture of the hot water system as operating perhaps by means of a loop of pipework somewhere either in the walls or in the ceiling. The outlets are not on that loop, they are at chest level, hand level, waist level, whatever. But in order to get to the outlets, you need a spur from the main loop to the tap. When you're talking about 1 minute to get hot water, does that effectively mean that you get 1 minute for the spur to empty?
In effect, yes. You are looking to make it as short as possible, but the general rule of thumb is it must be less than 2 meters in length, because if it's a 15mm diameter pipe, which is the standard pipe size for terminal pipework, that will clear within that 1 minute time period.
So effectively, if you have 2 meter pipe and you open a tap at one end, then to get rid of all the water that was originally within that pipe, should be a minute or less.
Yes. To give some context to that, within a domestic dwelling, you will probably have what's called a combination boiler. That does not generally recirculate a hot water system. So when you go to shave in the morning and you turn the tap on, it takes a couple of minutes for the hot water to come out the hot water tap. That is clearing that length of pipework on a non-recirculating system to reach temperature. It's exactly the same principle, but in the hot water of a non-domestic, then you have a circulating system, so the pipe length should be considerably shorter.
So because the sources are different in the hospital, the source is the loop, the nearest point in the loop, wherever the spur is attached to. In my house, it's the loft.
Yes.
Moving on to page 381, this is where we go into the overview of the hot water, domestic hot water system. Midway down the page, you begin discussing temperature results in 2015. There are two temperatures mentioned here, but perhaps I'll read it just to put them in proper context. 2015 preoccupation water risk assessment process, distribution temperatures were almost invariably above 50 degrees at all outlets, with direct hot feeds above 55 degrees Celsius. Return temperatures recorded at calorifiers were consistently below 55 degrees, which were advised as a control set point for these, though when calorifiers were at full temperature, the returns were reaching 50 degrees centigrade. This performance was below the recommended limits within the SHTM, and the control set points were amended to achieve a return temperature of 55 degrees Celsius as part of the process to address the identified compliance issues from the initial preoccupation risk assessment. Quite a lot in that, it seems to me. Could you give us as brief a summary of it as you can?
Yes. During the preoccupation water risk assessment, water sample or water temperature tests were taken and observed to be below 55 degrees. Within the SHTM, it makes the recommendation that all water, hot water, returning to the chlorifier or plant room area should be 55 degrees or above. It was set to only, it was performing to only reach 50 degrees. So I would imagine that the chlorifier set points were increased to elevate both the flow temperature and, by direct correlation, the return temperature by 5 degrees. So the return temperatures were then returning to the plant room at the 55 degree level or above.
Okay, so again, if we imagine the overall loop, one end of the ceiling right round the hospital and back to the calorifiers at the other, because it's a loop and because we're dealing with hot water, you would expect due to natural entropy, the temperature will be lower when it gets back than it is when it sets out.
Correct.
The specified temperature for when it gets back should be 55. Are you saying here that in practice, when it set out at 60 degrees, it was coming back not at 55, but 50? Is that right?
That was the indication from the risk assessment results.
And a way of curing that would be to set it out not at 60, but at 65. You still get the same heat loss, but now it's arriving at the magic number at 55 Celsius.
Technically, you will get a slightly higher rate of heat loss the higher the temperature differential. The total heat energy which the water contains is a fairly straightforward equation of the mass flow rate of the water, the specific heat capacity of water, and the temperature differential. So if you increase the temperature differential, you will increase the energy if the flow rate remains constant and the specific heat capacity remains constant. So without getting overly technical, yes, if you increase the flow, you will get a higher rate of return if all other things remain constant. It is not a straight line graph because the rate of heat exchange or heat loss is determined by the temperature differential. So as you increase it, it obviously increases that temperature differential.
Okay, so to correct myself, if it went out at 60 and was coming back at 50, then to get it coming back at 55, you might need to set out at 66.
Yes.
And that may be what's happened here in the last couple of lines when you're saying the control set points have been adjusted.
Yes.
The next paragraph makes an observation about unintended or perhaps intended consequences of increasing temperatures. First sentence, you're saying it's also noted that increasing the calorifier temperatures may have the beneficial effect of increasing cold water usage, as more cold water will be required valves to blend water to the valve set point, and so may assist in reducing the high cold water temperatures being recorded within the system. I think we're touching again there upon the link between movement and temperature. Is that correct? And can you explain that?
Yes, the thermostatic mixing valve, if it is set to deliver water at 43 degrees centigrade, if the hot water is at 65, to get the water down to 43, you will require a smaller percentage of the hot water and an increased percentage of the cold water to be blended through the thermostatic mixing valve to achieve the 43. So the higher the flow temperature on the supply, the natural occurrence is that you end up using a slightly increased level of cold water to bring that temperature down to the set point of the TMV.
Perhaps if there is a broader point, perhaps it's as simple as the fact that, at least to a layman like myself, water systems appear to be inherently complicated and to some extent perhaps unpredictable. Is that fair?
I think complicated is certainly fair, or they certainly can be. The predictability is dependent upon how and thoroughly it's designed and how complex it gets, but they can be fairly reliable and repeatable results can be achieved. So the predictability of performance can be achieved. Forecasting that moving from a design to an actual real life scenario can always bring challenges.
I have to say didn't immediately see the purpose of your reference to predictable. So
That was probably the wrong.
Can you help me? At a certain level, I would have thought an engineering system, such as the water system, theoretically, is predictable in its operation. So it's really just to make sure that I'm following your line of thinking, Mr. McKeever.
I think perhaps my line of thinking is less important than the witness's line of thinking. That's certainly what I understood from the answer of the question, my lord. If there's an error in the question or a wrong assumption in the question, then if it's produced a good answer, then I don't think I need to pose it again.
Fault is mine.
You did mention in your response that if the system were modelled, engineered correctly or to a particular standard, then it would be possible to get replicable outcomes, and therefore to that extent predictability is the wrong word for me to have used. But to think from the point of design or inception or thinking up the concept of the water system in the first place, thinking from there to the end point of actually turning on and water coming out, and bearing in mind that the answer must surely differ between simple systems and complex systems, how much confidence, or can one ever have 100% confidence that what is designed will be replicated when the system is actually built and put into operation?
I personally wouldn't say that you can be 100% certain. Obviously, these are based around long-established design standards and methodologies, and you can be fairly confident that it will work. However, if you could be 100%, then you would argue that you wouldn't necessarily need to commission or validate. And that is intrinsically required to any system to prove that what you predicted would happen at design stage has actually happened in the real world.
Follow that. I suppose my question is really, to put it in its broadest terms, how much value can one place in the modelling of a system, in the fact that something ought to have worked in theory?
If you undertake modelling of a system at design stage prior to installation, it can provide a level of assurance that in principle and the general parameters will work. But any modelling exercise requires a multitude of variables. And if any single variable is outside of that the model was based upon, it can result in different results in real world. So if you're looking at computer thermal modelling of a distribution system, this is how it should work according to our design, that is still having to be confirmed at the validation stage of, and does it work as we anticipated it would?
But the point is, that's the importance of validation.
Yes.
Quite a way further on at page 400, you do return to hot water temperatures in a different context, because here you're speaking about at 4115 about set results obtained in measurements taken in 2018. Now the issue here, first if we look at if I start reading from the end of the fourth line, it identified that the control set points for the hot water temperature control had been adjusted from 60 degrees to 65 degrees. And perhaps that's the change that we were alluding to a few minutes ago. However, this change had not been appropriately recorded. You've mentioned the importance of recording before. Can you comment on not recording the change in the output in the set point here?
Yes, it is a requirement of the water safety plan that any adjustment, alteration, maintenance activity which is undertaken should all be recorded, so there is a clear audit trail of what has been done, ideally with an explanation as to why it was done and evidence of the results of any alteration.
You then go on to describe the actual results. From information observed during the forensic analysis, evidence was recorded that although this adjustment had been made, the flow temperatures were at times as low as 58.1 degrees. Whilst this is a clear non-conformity of set point performance, it should be noted that at no time did the return water temperature fall below 53.2 degrees Celsius, which provides evidence of suitable and safe overall water temperature control. And then some remarks again about recording. With respect to the temperature specifically, I wonder if you can summarise the important points there from the actual temperatures not leaving the level, not reaching the level that were expected, but nevertheless not falling as far as the 53.2 degrees value.
It supports the previous statement in terms of the temperature of the water flowing out is referenced by the or is directly linked to the temperature of the water returning. It does fall below the set parameters of 55, but it doesn't drop below 50. So it is not unsafe as such, and at that point of return is immediately prior to the water effectively being reheated as it re-enters the plate heat exchanger clarifier to regain the temperature. But it should ideally, obviously as the set point is set at 65, not be coming off that at 58.1, it should be coming off at 65, at which point the return temperature would be, in all likelihood, well above the 55 degree recommended minimum.
Setting the recording issue to one side, what concerns occur to you as a result of that?
The hot water rate of recovery is based on how much hot water is drawn off at any given point at any outlet. On a very large complex hospital site, the water flow rate can be significant. And if the lower temperature coming back in, it's the rate of recovery that the plate heat exchanger or clarifier can achieve can be impaired if the return water is low. And certainly on this evidence, the set point being at 65 but only sending out at 58 would suggest that the plate heat exchanger wasn't capable of raising the water to the required set level at 65.
Where does that problem come from?
The more people who open hot water taps around the hospital, the more cold water you've got to reintroduce to get the volume of the system back up. And in exactly the same way as a TMV works, the clarifier works in the same basis. If you've got a certain volume taken out of hot water, that volume is made up of cold water, which naturally lowers the temperature, and the heat exchanger or clarifier is then required to raise it from a lower set point. If the return water is also below the 55, that only exacerbates the problem.
So we have a heater part of the calorifier that is not, for whatever reason, capable of producing the output that was specified. But does it follow that we can't know the root cause of that because it may depend upon how many hot water taps were open?
Yes.
Now we've moved from paragraphs beginning with 3 into paragraphs beginning with 4. That's because we're into the design, installation, commissioning, validation section that started at, I believe, 397. We start off this section by 411, describing the system as built to be generally in line with the principles set out in the SHTM 0401. See that? First couple of lines. But you then go on to identify 3 things indicating areas of concern. And they are subsequent requirement to install ultrafiltration and water treatment. And then you also mention failure to take account of tap selection and failure to take account of implications of point of use filters. Now, just to reconcile that, you're talking there about subsequent development. You start off the paragraph by saying this is generally, the system as built is generally in line with guidelines, but then you go on to indicate areas of concern, and they're evidenced by subsequent developments, as I understand. Is that right?
It is.
And then at 4.1.2, you approach matters from a different angle, saying here that the site has a very complex water distribution system, and during commissioning and pre-occupation risk assessment review process, a number of significant installation issues were identified which could have been designed out at an early stage. Now, firstly, the reference to the risk assessment, is that again a reference to the 2015 DMA Canyon report?
Yes, it is.
As I read it, I was having slight difficulty reconciling the 3 time perspectives in these 2 paragraphs. I wonder if you can reconcile them for me. You're talking about design at the start of 411, saying it's generally in line with the guidance. You then move on to making reference to subsequent developments indicating problems. And then at 4.1.2, you're talking about things which might have been designed out. Suggesting to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, suggesting to me that there were parts of the design that were not as good as they could have been. Is that too simple, or which seems to place matters back into the, do we look at whether things were in line with the guidance at the time and concluding that maybe they weren't. Is that, am I garbling that? Would you like to make that clearer?
I will endeavour to do so. I think the design in principle was in line with SHTM guidance. I think there are certain elements of the installation, such as the deployment of flexible hoses, that shouldn't have taken place in strict accordance to the SHTM, and they were installed. When I talk about design, I'm looking at the high-level design philosophy rather than the minutiae detail of an installation specification and the materials that can or can't be installed. So through any pre-occupation risk assessment of a new facility, as an AE, I would expect, at least hope, that there would be no defect or remedial actions identified. Because on a brand new system, given that the rule book is known, there's no reason why there should be defects identified. That was not the case in this instance. The later modification or adaptation of the system in terms of the ultrafiltration and water treatment, chlorine dioxide systems, came as a follow-up and perhaps, I don't know, but as a reaction to address some of the operational issues that were identified when the system was live. Has that clarified it and cleared it at all?
I think so. I think it's the reference to general in line with the principles as set out in the guidance. If that's a high level assessment of the system, then it follows that the matters, it would appear to follow that the matters in 4.1.2, such as high temperature gain or at certain cold water outlets or the hoses, you wouldn't consider those to be high level problems.
No.
So to take one of those, for example, the temperature gain resulting in the installation of dump valves to increase water flow, it would follow that you don't consider that to be a high-level problem. But if it's an issue that can be fixed by installing some dump valves, is that necessarily a problem at all?
It is, in that it actually breaches another HTM 0704, which is the unnecessary wastage of water. So if it depends upon if the system is designed in such a way that the usage is high enough to prevent the excess temperature gain on the cold water, then dump valves shouldn't be needed. If they are needed in operation and it's identified that they're needed in operation, it is an accepted method to do so, to install them, and it will address the issue. I have always interpreted that the requirement for a safe patient environment will supersede any requirement of energy conservation or wastage issues. So the fact that 0704 says you shouldn't waste water, I acknowledge, and it is a derogation of that. But if the result of not doing it would increase risk to patient, then I would place conformance to 0401 above that to 0704.
Okay, thank you. Moving over the page to paragraph 4.1.5. Here you're identifying a problem in relation to, well, in general, you're making a judgment on this on the system. I'll read it out rather than attempting to summarise and garbling it myself. Classification and vulnerability of the patient group was clearly well understood, and the impact of water systems in regard to the risk of system colonisation, transmission to patients, and appropriate measures to minimise these risks through the design, installation, commissioning and validation process through to the initial occupation and operation can best be described as suboptimal. And then you go on to give evidence for this, including but not limited to use of wet pressure testing, lack of comprehensive flushing of systems once wetted, failure to adequately protect pipework from contamination during installation, and poor performance of the cold water distribution pipework to maintain appropriate outlet water temperatures. Now, apart from the last of those, the references here are to a matter which we've heard some evidence about. To summarise, the way the system was constructed, in part being that it was filled early, drained, refilled, and then essentially remained in that condition perhaps for as long as 9 months before occupation and operations commenced around the time it opened. Just to help me make the best possible sense of this paragraph, I wonder if you can describe or comment on each of the failings you're identifying here. The first of them you've done so already, I think, wet pressure testing, and you told us about gas pressure testing earlier and why that would be a preferred alternative. Second point I've drawn out is lack of flushing once the system was wetted. You may have answered that already, but for completeness, can you tell us what the problem is there?
Once the system is wetted, it should be kept wet, and we then use flushing to basically replicate the system being in use. So as soon as you've wetted the system, it then goes into a program of all outlets being flushed on a regular basis to ensure avoidance of stagnation. There are no records present to say that that was undertaken during the construction stage, having wetted the system. And indeed, the system was wetted, drained, left for an extended period of time and re-wetted. The problem with that is that the damp system, for want of a better term, the wetted and then drained, has residual water and residual material that will promote microbiological growth. And in a completely separate hospital, which I work with, they had a building built 15 years ago where this was done, and they still have repeated problems and no level of disinfection, frequency of disinfection, or even turning the temperatures up to 70 have been able to completely cure it. So it is incredibly difficult once you get a systemic colonisation to clear it. And if you've got a wetted and then drained system, that promotes significantly, in my opinion, a systemic colonisation potential.
Third point you mentioned was the failure to adequately protect pipework from contamination during installation. That would seem to be part of what you're telling us about, but could you elaborate on that a little bit?
When pipework is installed or prior to being installed and delivered to site, it should be sealed. Plastic end caps normally. It shouldn't be left outside in the mud and contaminated. Once installed, at the end of each period of installation, ends should be again sealed so as to not to act as a point where contamination can ingress to the pipework system prior to it being sealed, as it were, or completed.
Maybe an obvious point, but what sort of contamination are we talking about? What's the problem with that?
Biggest problem is soil, which is absolutely laden with bacteria, but also open ends where you are doing other building works in the area. You will create dust, you will release fungal spores, you will potentially open it to any manner of contaminants.
And have no control at all.
And have no control over what goes in it, and clearing it out requires flushing, but you don't flush until you've completed everything, at which point you've put restrictions on the system. So it's not like clearing out an open hose pipe. It is had to go through valve seats and valve assemblies, and hence the proliferation and spreading of that potential contamination throughout the system.
The last problem that you mentioned in that paragraph was poor performance of cold water distribution pipework. I think you've covered that already, but that's a different order of problem to the build problems that you've identified previously in that sentence. Is there anything more to say about that than you've said already?
No, I don't think so.
Setting that to one side and just thinking about the pipework, the wet testing and so on, how obvious ought it to have been from your perspective during construction and installation that these are things to be avoided?
It is standard practice and has been for many years within healthcare that you do not wet pressure test. And it's been built into the HTM for a considerable period of time. So it surprises me that it was wet pressure tested at all.
And what about protection of the pipework?
Harder to achieve and is often a challenge on any building site, particularly one as large and complex as this. But again, it's very basic stuff. It's making sure the end of the pipework is capped at the end of the working day and then uncapped. It's not difficult to do, but it's difficult to provide assurance that it is done.
And I skipped over the lack of flushing once it had been wetted. How obvious would it have been to you that ought to have been done?
If there's no evidence or records to show it has been done, the assumption is that it hasn't.
Over the page at 399, you're mentioning a different type of issue at 4.1.11 at the foot of the page. And here you're mentioning specialist clinical areas, and to summarise that, you're saying that you'd have expected to see specific design stage risk assessments to ensure that those services stakeholders had been fully consulted on what's required, and you hadn't seen evidence of that. What conclusions did you draw from that?
My conclusion is that it didn't take place because there's no evidence that it did, and the pre-occupation risk assessment was not specific to clinical or different precautions or different levels of risk in different areas of clinical activity.
What consequences could flow from that?
Where you've got high risk patients or patient care facilities, then specific reference should be made and potentially supplementary precautions taken to ensure that adequate protection is provided and provide safe systems. Again, it is reflected in the recent NETB update that is now a requirement.
You do go on over the page to, in fact, a number of pages further on, 402, to make reference to the two risk assessments that carries out by DMA Canyon. We've already looked at 2015, and you see there was another one in 2017. Now, given the length of them and the nature of them, I don't want to bring them up necessarily. But here you have identified, among other things, the headline numbers. So in the third line of 4.2.1, you say that you're saying that the review resulted, that's the 2015 review, resulted in a detailed water risk assessment identifying a total of 494 issues or defects, and then classifications of them into high, medium and low risk. And you then say, given this was a then brand new installation, which designed and built to be fully compliant to the relevant healthcare SCM standards, this level of defects is considered completely unacceptable. Do you want to or feel the need to elaborate upon that at all?
I don't think I could put it any stronger.
And you give examples of some of those issues below, and they relate to some things we looked at: hoses, aeration's a new issue, hot and cold water temperatures, and then hot outlets not complying to latest regulations. Before it, the next paragraph, you are referring to 2017 report, numbers different, lower, but still 168 remaining to be addressed, and classification of them into high, medium and low risk. And here you give examples, remaining issues being evidence of heat gain and a defective flushing regime. Words used in the second line are some significant improvement. But at 4.2.3, you're saying that for a new system which has been designed to fully conform to the then current standards, this is considered as a highly unsatisfactory situation, though it does provide evidence of positive progress to identify and address issues by the estates team. The language you've used, highly unsatisfactory or completely unacceptable, you say is very strong, but you do balance that out a little bit by talking about positive progress. The positive progress that you've seen by 2017, does that cure at all or mitigate at all the completely unacceptable view that you'd reached as regards 2015?
It demonstrates that there were issues that had been identified were being addressed. The fact is that in a brand new system, there shouldn't have been issues to be addressed. Significant improvement had been achieved and made within that, but it doesn't negate the fact that if you'd bought a brand new car and it didn't work very well and had hundreds of defects, after 2 years, would you still be happy if it still had at least over 100 defects? So it all stems back to the original installation was non-compliant. Significant progress had been made, but significant progress still remained to be made, including 65 high-risk elements.
To think back to the first key question that the report was all about, which was essentially from time of occupation, was the water system in a safe condition? At the point 2015, what's the answer to that question?
As I've expressed before, it is very difficult to put a binary answer to is something safe or unsafe. It was certainly suboptimal, and it certainly didn't comply to all of the requirements of SHTM standard.
In relation to 2017?
Improved, but still not compliant.
Now, you deliberately aren't putting that in terms of safe or not safe.
Correct.
Why not?
Something is safe or unsafe depending upon multiple variables. So a system, a water system that is never used is not unsafe. It is not what you want, and if you then use it, it would be unsafe because it had sat for a long period of time being unused. So the safety or lack thereof is a sliding scale, not a black and white binary, something is safe or unsafe. So it requires a combination of events for a system to have an adverse impact. It equally cannot be ever described as completely safe because there are inherent microbiological risks with water.
When you use the expression adverse impact, could you just, what are you thinking about?
Without wishing to be flippant, if this was a hotel which was handling healthy people with no immunosuppression and all the rest of it, would it be as risky as it were a hospital? No, it wouldn't. The compliance or non-compliance of it would still be the same, but the exposure of that hazard and likelihood of resulting risk would alter. So seeing it in its context as a highly specialised acute healthcare provision, probably one of the most vulnerable user groups possible, is why it was non-compliant and unsafe both at the time of occupation and arguably safer in 2017, but still not fully compliant.
Now, the instances of non-compliance by their nature, are things that need not have been so. I mean, that's not a well-put question, but when we're talking about instances of non-compliance, the starting position is that if there's a requirement to comply, therefore it is possible to comply. And the instances of compliance you've been drawing attention to are intended to reduce infection risk.
Yes.
So what was identified by DMA Canyon in 2015 and in 2017 were a number of instances where measures that could have been taken to reduce risk and were required by current guidance to be in place were not in place.
Correct.
Now, it seemed to me that that takes us to a position where if measures that could have been taken, should have been taken to reduce risk are not in place, then the hospital presented a greater risk to patients than it need have done.
Yes.
Right. Whether that actually resulted in adverse instances is, of course, a different matter.
Yeah.
While it's on the screen, we have ancillary considerations at 4.3, and this was dealing with a completely separate question that was asked of you, whether the hospital's proximity to Shield Hill wastewater treatment works created a risk of infection to patients. This was in relation to a sewage plant nearby to the hospital site. Is that correct?
Correct.
Your answer's straightforward here, which is no.
Yeah.
But just to be clear about that, you're expressing your view in relation to the water system.
Correct.
And you're not in a position to make comment on whether there's any other conceivable nexus of transmission.
No.
We see at the bottom of that page, the commissioning at handover section begins. 5.1 is about commissioning, and I think you've explained to us already the importance of commissioning and validation, the linked validation process. You set out over the following 4 pages, and I won't go through these in detail, but if we go on to the next one, we've got a list of typical steps, which I think is slightly difficult to tell because the font is the same on all pages. But this, I think, is a direct lift from the requirements of SHTM. Is that correct?
It is.
1 or 2 that will perhaps get you to just explain the significance of. Number 6, we've almost touched on this before, but it's talking about flushing, and you're saying there, should be undertaking following pressure testing and should be the first action once a system is wetted for the first time, after which the system should be subject to regular twice-weekly simulated in-use flushing to ensure stagnation of the system is minimised. My question is, what's the significance of the first flush in particular?
It was intended to say that as soon as the system is wetted, flushing should commence. There should be no time delay between wetting the system and commencing a flushing programme.
Why is that important? If we move on to a system of twice weekly flushing every 3 or 4 days, why is it different for the first flush? Why does it have to be done immediately?
It's more a case of it's trying to emphasise that it needs to start. If you wetted the system and did the pressure test and commenced flushing within 2 days, that would be the first flushing. It's not intended as immediate, but it should be commenced as soon as the system has been wetted and continue until occupation and full use.
Thank you. Over the page, point 8 is about temperature control and checking for cold water systems to ensure no excessive heat gains experienced, for hot water systems to ensure appropriate circulation and design. That may or may not be the same issue as we've spoken about beforehand. It appeared to me that the expression might be different in that one might be about getting up to temperature and the other is concerned about heat gain. Am I wrong about that? Is there anything specific to understand about point 8?
No, the thing with point 8 is that the design should ensure that the incoming water temperature does not achieve more than 2 degrees C temperature gain throughout the course of the system.
Why is that 2 degrees heat gain? What does that tell us?
It keeps the water system within a safe operational parameter for the control of microbiological proliferation for Legionella. And that's not easy to say. So it is designed to make sure that the system throughput doesn't experience excessive heat gains.
And is that linked to the point that you've started out by explaining that temperature and movement are inherently linked?
It is. It's also the fact that heat gain on a cold water system isn't a steady graph. If you miss a section of thermal insulation from one part of the cold water pipe and heat it up, by the time it then goes back into and blends with other cold water that was fully insulated, you will get a subtle increase, but not the same temperature as the uninsulated pipe. So the overall gain across the entire system is designed to acknowledge that, but keep it to within safe operational parameters.
Over the page, 407, in fact 2 pages further on this built list, 407 has point 10. You're talking about initial disinfection. Now, I spoke about chemical dosing in a kind of broader, more permanent context earlier. To understand this initial disinfection to be a different, separate process.
It is.
Can you explain that to me?
Yes, when a system is first wetted, it gets what would be typically described as a shock disinfection. So these are higher concentrations of a chemical disinfecting agent, higher than would be safe to be present for a system in use, but designed to act to kill any present microorganisms in the system from a starting point. So you start with a clean water system.
Now, after having set out these steps, you move on at 5.2.1 to dealing with system pressure testing and flushing. And there you start out by considering the construction phase. Capping of pipes is mentioned there, and you've covered that already. 5.2.2 you may have covered, but I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to ask the question, and if you've already answered it, do tell me. You make a reference there to, again, to wet testing, and you talk about, in some cases, then drained down and left. Is there a specific problem that arises from draining down as opposed to filling a system too early and leaving it filled?
Filling a system too early and leaving it filled is a problem if it's not then subject to regular flushing to avoid stagnation. Wetting the system, getting all of the surfaces wet and then draining down, there is some research that says that promotes microbiological growth activity because the organisms grow more strongly in a damp environment rather than a completely wetted environment.
Thank you. over the page at 523 and 524, here you're drawing attention to a mismatch between dates, I think. And there's an inconsistency, more than one date available to you to indicate when flushing might have taken place. What's the point from these paragraphs?
It's really just evidence of, or lack of evidence of, consistent, regular flushing of the systems.
Just give me a moment, please. The next page has at the foot of it 5.4. Again, we're returning to matter we touched on in part, TMVs, thermostatic mixing valves and thermostatic mixing taps, TMT commissioning. Can you tell us about these? You told us about the valves already. You may have alluded to, but I think not explained the taps. Can you tell us about these items?
A TMT is ostensibly the same as a TMV, but the mixing process takes place within the tap body rather than as a separate valve component prior to the tap outlet. Do you want me to explain how a TMT stroke TMV works? In basic terms,
Yeah, if you can.
it will take a volume of hot water and a volume of cold water to create a desired temperature at the outlet, typically 43 degrees for a wash hand basin. As we've spoken, the flow temperature may well be of the hot water at 60 or above. The cold water should hopefully be less than 20. So the proportion of mixing is controlled by a bimetal strip, typically, that expands and contracts to a required level of opening of the two valves to get the desired flow temperature. Both the hot and the cold water supplies to the valve, whether it be a TMV or a TMT, are installed with backflow protection devices to make sure that you can get no cross-contamination of cold water into the hot water or hot water into the cold. And they are also fitted with strainers to remove large particulates to ensure that the valve seat appropriately works. One of the required tests for these devices is what's referred to as a cold water shut-off test. So in the event that the cold water failed, there was a burst, the valve must stop all flow within a prescribed time period to ensure that untempered water cannot be released through the valve and therefore potentially pose a scalding risk to a user.
Right, that, I think later on, I don't have the paragraph reference, I'm afraid, but I recall it was in there. Later on in your report, refer to that scalding risk as a never event. Maybe obvious, but please explain what that is.
The NHS have designated that scalding is an avoidable risk and therefore should never occur within its premises.
And the valves are the means of achieving that.
They are one of the means of achieving it.
Could I just ask you to repeat that last point? Scalding is an avoidable risk, and therefore the NHS, and I failed to note what you went on to say.
Have classified it as a never event. Again, back, and it has always been, it should never happen. One of my job or career progressions when I first became a head of estate was at a learning disabilities trust who had operated for a number of years without a head of estates. There was an incident involving a patient with severe learning disabilities being scalded to death by being placed in a bath where the TMV had failed and it hadn't been picked up. So the consequences of scalding, while some people might think that's a bit hot and pull your hand out of it, is fine. But where there is cognitive impairment, then it can be extremely serious and up to and including fatal.
Thank you.
Just to cover the last two lines on the page, evidence reviewed, including samples of testing records, show that while TMVs have been subject to routine testing and maintenance, the level of information recorded and the stabilisation testing of replace TMV or TMT cartridges does not follow the current SHTM standards. What conclusion do you draw from that?
This is where I run the risk of getting very nerdy, so I apologise in advance. Thermostatic mixing valves have always had a requirement for 6 monthly in-use testing. That testing is undertaken. I can't remember the exact date, but the DO8 standards for testing of thermostatic mixing valves were adjusted and altered, I believe in 2017, where they made alterations to the prescribed test methodology. The function testing was still the same, but specific volumes of water over specific time frames as part of the cold water shutoff test were included. There is no evidence within the records to say that that volumetric measurement testing took place on the TMVs, but the TMVs were subject to routine testing. When a TMV is first installed, there is a requirement within the SHTM to undertake what are called stabilisation tests. So you put it in, you commission it, you make sure it's working to the correct parameters. 6 to 9 weeks later, you go back and check that it is still operating within those parameters. 12 to 15 weeks after that, you go back and check that it is continuing to work within its specified parameters. Thereafter, it gets incorporated into the regular 26 or 6 monthly testing cycle. The stabilisation phase of testing, I have not seen evidence of being completed.
You told us about the potential consequences of scalding beforehand. Does that elevate the degree of concern that one would have around the process or lack of completion of a process you've just described to us?
Certainly for any area of whole body submersion, it would be a serious concern to me.
So we know there are baths, for example, for some patients. Though, if, as you're describing, there's a lack of recording of full testing, validation, whatever, of the valves, of the taps, then that would be a serious problem.
It would, although the healthcare organisation would typically have a bathing policy, and that bathing policy should include a fail-safe manual check of any full body submersion water temperature prior to a cognitive impaired user using it. So there are fail-safes built in that are not reliant on the mechanical device in the pipework.
My fault entirely, Mr. Poplett. You set out at 5.4.2 the testing regime of TMVs, and you draw particular attention to the test to cover the possibility of cold water failure and therefore scalding risk. Is just I'm trying to locate that point in the paragraph. In other words, could you just help me with what particular test, as recorded in your report, you had not seen documentation of the test being carried out?
It is covered under 5.51 at the top of page 412. So part B on the bottom of 411 says isolate the cold water supply of the mixing valve and observe the mixed water outlet. So having turned the cold water off, you check the tap. If there is a flow stream after 5 seconds, then collect any water discharging into a suitably graduated marked vessel for 60 seconds. And if that volume of water collected is greater than 120 millilitres, then recommission or service work is needed. So that is describing in a measurable means whether the valve has passed or failed its cold water shut off.
And that is what you did not find having been recorded.
Correct.
Thank you.
I have nothing additional about valves, so this would be a convenient point to stop for the moment.
Right, might be a time to take our lunch break, Mr. Poplett. So could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?